there not dancing. She's a dancer, but she's also a basketball player and injured her leg and had an operation on. My granddaughter.
How about that being serenaded Tlingit style, the New Clean Dancers? I wanted to say, give a shout out to the servers who served those who are around 65 years old. How about giving them a round of applause? We wanted to change the order just a little bit. We wanted to hear the keynote speaker tonight, and then we were going to hear some poems from the illustrious Martin Strand, the illustrious late Martin Strand. That is going to be read by Dick Downhauer and others. And Stephen Haycox, in our efforts to clear the stage for the dance groups, we went ahead and put the podium aside. Is that okay? We want to make sure that there is a proper introduction of the keynote speaker, that there's no feedback. We might have to have you stand about here, Stephen. No? Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, 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 1, 2, 3. Testing. Try over here. Try over there. Apologize, we didn't do any stage testing beforehand. I think we're amateurs when it comes time to planning for the for stage sound. But I wanted to have Dick Downhauer to do the introduction of our keynote speaker tonight. This is one half a person. Usually when you introduce Dick, it's Dick and Nora Downhauer. And so I feel like I'm only introducing half a person tonight to do the introduction. But please give Dick Downhauer a warm welcome. I think over here is about the best place because there's feedback over in the middle.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. It's an honor to introduce. My introduction will only be half as long because I'm only half of the show here tonight. So, and in fact, it's not very long. Should I proceed with that? Or is there going to be a podium, Jerry? Is that what we're? Oh, that's just going to be theater in the round. This is good. Oh, okay. I've known Steve for many years, and he's been a partner in crime in some of our projects. He was a contributor to some of our books. I think most of us know him as one of the foremost authorities on the history of the Alaska Native Brotherhood and so many of the civil rights efforts that the especially Tlingit people were taking the lead in during the 1920s and 1930s. But I'll read you a few of his achievements here that were kind of new to me, so that hopefully will be new to you too also. Professor Stephen Haycox is an American cultural historian at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. He specializes in the relationship of Alaska to the history of the American West. His graduate degrees are from the University of Oregon. He has published widely on Alaska Native history. His two most recent books are Frigid Embrace, I love that, Frigid Embrace, Politics, Economics, and Environment in Alaska, and his other book, Alaska, an American Colony. He is the recipient of an Alaska Governor's Humanities Award in 2003 and the University of Alaska Edith R. Bullock Prize for Excellence in 2002. And Steve, I'm jealous of that one. Congratulations on that one. And he was named Alaska Historian of the Year by the Alaska Historical Society in 2003. He teaches American history, history of the American West, and American environmental history. Okay, and here he is. Welcome to Sitka.
Thank you. Terrific. Thank you so much, Dick. It's a real honor to be asked to be here and to talk with you for a few moments. I want to thank the organizers of this Clan Conference, which is a terrific event. Of course, Peter Metcalf and Kathy Ruddy and Ishmael Hope, Sergei Khan, and many, many others I'm leaving out. It's terrific. And also I'd like to dedicate my remarks to the memory of Andy Hope III, who, of course, was the driving force behind all of this. I try not to make public talks without paper in front of me. I can't work without props, so I will refer to my text from time to time. I'm not had the native experience, not being native. I came to Alaska in 1970 and early began to look into the history of not just the Brotherhood, but a lot of native issues, because there hadn't been a great deal of work done on some of the things that I thought were important and interesting. And I grew to have immense respect for Alaska's native people and the native experience. Some of my remarks may be a little bit sensitive, and I hope that I don't tread on any toes, and I beg your forgiveness if I do. I'd like to take as my subject today acculturation. I want to address some of its historical aspects among Alaska Natives, and particularly Tlingit-Haida people. More particularly, I want to discuss acculturation of Tlingit and Haida people as it was pursued as an explicit policy of the U.S. federal government and the Christian missionary establishment in Alaska before and after the turn of the century, and where this has brought us to today, which is, I think, a good place. By acculturation, I mean the replacement of one set of cultural mores, beliefs, and behaviors by another. In this case, adoption of such values as economic, individual independence, and American civic literacy in place of clan and moetic identity and ritual, and the clan assignment of social responsibility. I'm not a trained anthropologist, and I recognize first that acculturation is a complex and multi-layered concept and phenomenon, and second, that anthropologists have engaged in a long discussion about the nature of culture itself, whether it is more useful to understand culture as a bounded system of shared meaning, essentially consistent over time, or a set of processes where shared meanings are continuously being constructed and contested, so much that the dynamism rather than the consistency defines the culture. I find myself more inclined toward the latter view than the former, that the dynamic evolution of culture is a more realistic way of understanding its character, and I'll try to explain what I mean by that. But whatever the case may be, I think it's clear that when they came into Alaska in the 1870s and the 1880s, personnel of the American federal government and the various Christian mission societies pursued an overt and well-articulated policy to eradicate traditional native culture, which they regarded as backward and an impediment to native survival, and to replace it with the American cultural values of economic, social, political, and intellectual individualism within a context of American Protestant religious faith. Let me review some of the history of acculturation in Alaska briefly. This phenomenon itself, I think, has been somewhat misunderstood. Actively forcing acculturation among Alaska Natives rather than waiting for whatever syncretism might take place over time was the explicit policy of the government in the last portion of the 19th century. That's when the Bureau of Education was charged by the Interior Department to implement Congress's mandate of 1884 that schools be established in Alaska under the direction of a general agent of education and the jurisdiction of the U.S. Commissioner of Education. Congress made the policy of acculturation explicit and comprehensive in the 1887 Dawes General Allotment Act, which applied to all Native Americans. That act, which became the archetype for the government's policy, mandated formal severalty from tribal association and the living of an acculturated life, which they called a civilized life, as a requirement for what they considered to be the benefits proffered by the act. In Alaska, under the first Organic Act for the territory, the first general agent was, of course, Sheldon Jackson. Jackson had already been at work in Alaska, as most of you know, as the agent of the Presbyterian Board of Home Missions. The mission societies in Alaska adopted the same policies as the government. In fact, government education personnel and mission society personnel were often interchangeable and indistinguishable. Dick Dauenauer has written persuasively about Jackson's acculturation policy, comparing it unfavorably for its lasting impact on Native life with that of Jan Venyaminov, Bishop Innocent. There may be a complication here that Dick missed, with all due respect. Jackson was a member of a group of reformers who called themselves Friends of the Indian. These friends were a progressive minority in the 1870s and the 1880s. This was a time when, as the historian at the University of Victoria, Professor Brian Dippie, has written, most Americans thought indigenous Americans were rapidly dying off, living a doomed and tragic life. The term used repeatedly in public and private discourse was the vanishing Indian. It was too bad, many thought, but nothing could be done about it, as the inexorable wave of progress swept across the American West. The reformers reacted against that fatalism. They thought it was immoral to allow the disintegration of a proud and capable people, and they set out to do what they could to prevent it. Indian people must survive, the Friends determined. But for that to happen, they reasoned, Indian culture must not survive. You're familiar with their program, which was designed as an emergency measure, since they believed they had very little time to prevent the tragedy that they saw developing before them. So their program was the boarding schools, the English only, and the mastery of some basic economic employable skills like carpentry and homemaking, and as often as not, Christianity. In assessing Jackson and the Friends of the Indian and 19th century U.S. acculturation policy, we have to remember the time. We have to remember that, as has often been quoted, the past is a strange country. They do things differently there. We must remember that we're talking about the world of Jim Crow, about the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Plessy versus Ferguson that separate facilities for different races were constitutional. We must remember it was a time of cultural absolutism. People thought there could only be one right way to be. Dagmar, my wife, and I were reminded of this when we came into Sitka again this afternoon. And I looked at the Pioneer Home and remembered that we celebrate the beginning of the Pioneer Home, and up in Anchorage, we live near the Anchorage Pioneer Home where men and women that we know live. But when the Pioneer Home was first constructed and opened, it was for men only, no women, and of course, for non-natives only, no natives. Times do change. That world is not our world. And we have to be careful that while we may judge the morality of what was done then by today's standards, we must try to understand the historical constraints that operated on people and explains their motivation then. The people then could only operate within their own enculturation, the standards that they had been taught as children. We should be neither surprised nor scandalized that the people of any one time in history thought as they did. We should instead seek to understand why. I would add something as an aside here, that when it comes to trying to force a set of beliefs and behaviors thought to be superior to others onto other nations or other people, there may not be quite as wide a gulf between the past and our own time as we sometimes assume. It's not uncommon today to hear people profess that there's only one legitimate cultural form, American. And that others are illegitimate. Of course, the one they're a part of is always the one they think is the legitimate one. It seems to me then that it's only appropriate to discuss the founders of the Alaska Native Brotherhood and Alaska Native Sisterhood and William and Lewis Paul and other leaders within the context of their own time. The Native leaders of 1912, 1915, and 1920 were educated and nurtured in an environment that made these same assumptions, that acculturation was the only program for survival of Native people. As we know, the ANB and ANS founders had all been students at the Sheldon Jackson School. All three Paul brothers, there were three, were taught there, and subsequently at the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania under the guidance of General Richard Pratt. It cannot be a matter of wonder then that the objective of the organization the founders established and that the Paul brothers and others subsequently molded was full acculturation. Philip Drucker, with whose work many of you are familiar, and whose description of the brotherhood and sisterhood origins is something of a Bible for students of the organization's histories, noted that the initial constitution of the ANB specified that eligibility for membership included, quote, English-speaking members of the native residents of the territory of Alaska, end quote. He lists as the policies of the early brotherhood citizenship, education, and the abolition of Aboriginal customs, most especially, of course, the potlatch. He notes that what the government and the mission societies understood as a civilized life, that phrase taken from the 1887 Dawes Act, was also what the brotherhood and the sisterhood understood as a civilized life. Rapid and complete acculturation. William Paul put on the masthead of the Alaska Fisherman, the monthly newspaper that the ANB published from 1923 to 1932, one nation, one language, one people. Drucker reports that in the face of the ANB's denigration of the potlatch and other traditional cultural forms, these forms fell out of favor. In fact, it may not be too strong to say that they were suppressed, in the sense that those who might have accepted them, as the ANB and the ANS grew into successful and ubiquitous organizations, kept their clan and traditional loyalties hidden, or at least did not proclaim them and acknowledge them within the community. To do so would have invited criticism from the acculturated leadership and would have been seen in many instances as a sign of backwardness and lack of enlightenment. It is this suppression of traditional culture that I want to focus on. There were plenty of exceptions to it, certainly. Drucker notes that the ANB never formally went on record to oppose clan and moietic identification, and suggests that retention of Aboriginal custom never rose to the level of a resolution before the annual convention, probably because people recognized its complexity and its potential for disruption. But the disapproval was real. One well-known Tlingit elder told me some years ago that he remembered that before the war, people in his village never mentioned their clan identity in public for fear of disapproval and even reprisal. But, Drucker says, potlatching was so closely intertwined with clan and moietic identity that many people experienced tension between their identification with traditional forms and their commitment to the acculturative context of the brotherhood and sisterhood. Drucker's examples of such tension are poignant and remind us of the difficulty of negotiating a complex cultural milieu. Again, many people apparently suppressed their affinity for clan identity so as not to lose face or to offend. My reading suggests to me that self-suppression of traditional forms was widespread and enforced by social subtleties that we would all recognize. I believe it was common and pervasive. But the pervasive rejection of tradition did not last. Over time, it changed, and changed dramatically. It was never complete, of course, and it was already changing by the time Drucker did his field work in 1952. By then, numbers of people had begun to resolve the tensions they felt between tradition and acculturation in some interesting ways. The courage that some of them found to more openly embrace traditional forms, which they did, may have been due to Congress's passage of the Tlingit-Haida Jurisdictional Act in 1935, which organized the filing of the Tlingit-Haida land claims suit. It may also have been inspired by the passage of the bill in 1936 that brought the Indian Reorganization Act to Alaska. The IRA closed the era of acculturation as a national Indian policy, replacing it with self-determination. The IRA not only authorized the formation of tribal governments, but committed the federal government to recovery of as much of the Indian land base nationally as possible. It established a revolving credit fund for Indian businesses and an education fund. It was a breath of fresh air. But it took a long time for the implications of the IRA to be fully realized, not really until today. The establishment of tribal governments was very paternalistic in the beginning, and the expectation within the BIA, which took over Native Services in Alaska from the Bureau of Education in 1931, was still acculturation and suppression of traditional Native cultural forms. Nonetheless, the promise of the IRA may have inspired some people to a more open expression of ancient cultural practices, even though for some it was a major struggle with tension between the modern and the traditional that needed resolution. One Christian respondent told Drucker he found resolution by regarding the potlatch explicitly as a historical phenomenon, completely separate from religion. I thought about it a long time, he said, and I read the Bible a lot. And when he had become comfortable with his resolution, he stepped out and held a major potlatch, following the traditional forms. By the 1950s, Drucker noted, clan houses began to be rebuilt in a number of villages, in some cases at first outside the city limit, but later within the villages proper. Increasing numbers of people, he observed, had begun to take ancient clan names, and potlatching began to become more common. There was, Drucker wrote, the beginning of a slow but persistent revival of Aboriginal cultural forms. We can see clearly today that that revival gained in strength after Drucker's time. It was doubtless expanded with the civil rights revolution of the 1960s. That movement was not only about legal constraints on equal treatment, but also about proclaiming and manifesting the legitimacy of minority Americans. Following the U.S. Supreme Court's historic 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, such national cultural events as the news photos and television coverage of the Little Rock Nine, the students who could only attend Central High School there in 1957 with the protection of federal troops, these things were as visible in Alaska as they were anywhere else in the country, and they stood ultimately as a rebuke to discrimination on the basis of not just ethnicity, but also culture. Cultural revival, the reconstruction of traditional cultural forms, was an integral part of the civil rights movement. The success of the challenges to segregation in schools, in housing, in employment, and in other aspects of life gave huge impetus to the cultural revival movement, in a sense giving permission to minority people in the United States to come out, as it were, to throw off the suppression of traditional culture. In Southeast Alaska, the finding of the U.S. Court of Federal Claims in 1959 in the Tlingit-Haida land claim suit, namely that at the time of the purchase of Alaska, the Tlingit-Haida people retained title to all of the land in the Alexander Archipelago, and that they should be compensated for the later taking of that title to their land by the U.S., added to the growing sense of legitimacy in Alaska of the origins and ancient forms of traditional Tlingit and Haida culture. This sense of ancient legitimacy only grew with the maturation of the civil rights movement, and one saw a manifestation of that in the revival of native art forms and dancing, and their display and interpretation, and not just locally, but ultimately across the world. And in Alaska, then came the monumental land claims settlement, ANCSA. It would be difficult to underestimate the impact of ANCSA on Alaska Native people's sense of legitimacy. With a signature on December 17, 1971, so to speak, Alaska Native people achieved not just a role, but a status in Alaska's broader cultural context that simply had not existed earlier. Such leaders as John Borbridge, Roy Hundorf, Oliver Levitt, and many others have asserted that the Claims Settlement Act elevated Alaska Natives as did no other single event in modern times. If that is true, and surely it is, the act also elevated individual natives' sense of self, native pride, and self-dignity, as many have testified. Thus, the individual native's sense of self elevated and expanded, and the collective elevation of Alaska Native people generated by ANCSA still further legitimized the revival of traditional cultural forms, encouraging Native people to revive ancient identities, renew ancient ceremonies, and take pride in being Native. For many, it erased whatever tension still existed between the modern and tradition. Let me emphasize here a fundamental perspective on acculturation. It is of especial significance that as tradition was revived, it did not replace acculturated behavior. It wasn't an either-or proposition. It's this that I wish to focus on in conclusion. Today, the generation after the Civil Rights Revolution, 40 years after the passage of ANCSA, we can observe, I submit, that what eventuated was a cultural hybrid, an amalgamation of tradition and acculturation, if you will, a constructed social, intellectual, and artistic cultural evolution. It's weighted toward acculturation, of course, but it's commonplace nowadays for Tlingit and Haida people to introduce themselves in their traditional language, by giving their clan identity. It is no rarity for people on important non-Native occasions to appear in traditional Native dress at such ceremonies as high school and college graduations, at church weddings, at the opening of new offices or the establishment of new organizations. Much more important, it's not uncommon for clan leaders to hold potlatches and to acknowledge and participate in moetic exchanges consistent with ancient forms regarding funerals, weddings, and births. Alaska Natives, Tlingit and Haida people, I would assert, have effected a dynamic evolution of their cultures that allows legitimacy and comfort with traditional forms that stands in stark contrast to the suppression of traditional ritual that characterized the period of the ascendancy of the brotherhood and sisterhood. And they have done so with no sacrifice of capability and facility with modern cultural forms, that is, with acculturated mores and behavior. They are comfortable, able to function, if you will, with equal facility in both worlds, traditional and modern. I believe this is a signal achievement and should be recognized as such. I believe it is something to be loudly and widely celebrated. From a world in which it was suspect to be Native, where for being Native one could be made to feel awkward and uncomfortable, today it is commonplace and natural to be Indian and American too. So much so that one is tempted to remark, what's the big deal? I think it's this. It was not always so. It's a very different world now than it once was. And it's a hugely positive difference, one that one and the same time dignifies Native people and enriches and teaches all of us in the larger culture. It helps to teach us what equality really means. It humbles our former arrogance and broadens our understanding of the personal freedom that we claim to pursue as good Americans. For all of that, I think those of us in the non-Native world owe you a deep debt of gratitude, for you show us what we once could not imagine, that there's not just one cultural way to be, but there are many, and as expressions of separate cultural histories, they are all legitimate. I hope my meaning is clear here. Alaska Native people have survived and surmounted a discrimination and cultural persecution from an earlier time to emerge as people of dignity and capability who have demonstrated that they can succeed and prosper in a multiplicity of worlds, a variety of contexts. It is not too much to say, I think, that in this context, acculturation worked. And for that example, for that lesson, for myself, let me say I applaud you and I thank you. You have enriched Alaska, you have enriched America, you have enriched us all. Again, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to talk with you tonight.
I wanted to not let Steve go so quickly, mainly because as he was speaking, it occurred to me that a person of his stature gets it when he talks about the kind of conflict that a person had to struggle internally to suppress our own culture and our own identity and to belong to the dominant culture, yet wanting to love yourself, love our own culture, love your own culture, speak your own language, but couldn't. And it occurred to me that this is something that drives a lot of illness, a lot of isms, alcoholism, and all kinds of social ills. But to have a person who is able to look at a breadth of time within our own lifetimes, and a little bit earlier perhaps, is something that is really special. And so, because of that, I claim the first right to adopt him. A soon-to-be Sitka. We have a couple of presentations, and this is actually from the New Clean dancers, Heather and Lil. They have an announcement.
Ganashish, on behalf of the New Clean dancers, we're very, very thankful for being able to dance for you tonight. And so when we brought our blanket out, we received an overwhelming amount of support. We wanted to let you know how important it is for us, how important our hakusti. We wanted to donate $300 of the money that was donated to us towards the conference so that we can make sure that this is happening and perpetuating year after year. Ganashish. Ganashish.
I wanted to bring Dick Downhauer, who is he's the most powerful person in our group because he's the treasurer. She has a brother to bond with. She's a treasurer. He's a treasurer. But he